Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm really delighted that today I have the opportunity to talk with Tish Harrison Warren. She's a woman that I've admired a great deal for many years as a writer and as an Anglican priest. She's written several significant and award-winning books. One is Liturgy of the Ordinary, Sacred Practices in Everyday Life, and Prayer in the Night for those who work or watch or weep. Both were award-winning books and are very valuable. And today's book, in line with it in many ways, is a book that's called What Grows in Weary Lands on Christian Resilience. We're going to have an opportunity to explore with her what that book is about and the call for resilience at a time when the church needs all resilience that it can get. She currently serves as the C.S. Lewis Theological Writer-in-Residence for the Anglican Episcopal House of Studies at Baylor's Seminary, and she's a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum and an assisting priest at Emmanuel Anglican Church in Austin, Texas. Tish, welcome to Conversing.
Yeah, it's really fun to be with you.
You know, I've been part of the cheerleading squad for your writing for many years. I've benefited from it deeply. I've followed your column and you were writing it in the New York Times. And I've had all kinds of curiosities. I hope one day we'll actually have an opportunity to meet in person. But today is the closest I've gotten, and I'm just really thankful for your willingness to have this conversation together. You've written this new book that is just launching, and I'm so delighted to have read it and been fed and nurtured, challenged by it in many different ways. It's entitled, again, What Grows in Weary Lands on Christian Resilience. Tell us a bit about what brought you to start writing this book.
Yeah. So I would say the season that I wrote for the Times and after that, so pretty much the whole time I was there and after, I was struggling a lot with feeling exhausted. Some of this was just the stage of life. I had young kids and I had a mom who has dementia and Alzheimer's. And so in that sandwich generation, right? Sandwich between aging parents and still kids at home and young kids. I had a baby at 40, so we had a little tiny guy, even, and then 2 elementary age and teenage girls. So there was that, but it was deeper than that. It was like kind of a spiritual malaise. I was struggling with doubt in a way that I hadn't before. Prayer felt really hard. It felt like I was going to prayer. And after there had been a season of real fruitfulness in that and kind of beauty. And then it sort of felt like I told my husband, like the line went dead. It felt like God was hard to find. And I had a lot of working at the Times. And before then, I was busy. I was struggling a lot with anxiety, but it did not feel like I was in a spacious place or a fruitful place. I wasn't depressed and I wasn't undergoing great grief or tragedy. My kids were okay. I was okay. Things were all right, but I felt disoriented and like life was hard, and then I was kind of muddling through, putting one foot in front of the other for a long time. And I mean that creatively and spiritually as well.
You know, I think early in the book, you set out some of the things that were part of this season that you're describing. And and part of the journey that you were on in your own discovery, reflection, and ultimately in the writing that you've done in this book that captures some of the reasons why you were drawn to this issue of resilience, your own fatigue and exhaustion and the malaise that you describe. And I wonder if you could just take a few moments to read some of those early paragraphs or sections of the book, which really opens with a chapter that defines in many ways the why of your writing. Give us a reading, if you would, please, and then we'll jump off from there.
Okay, I'm going to give a short reading. Really, all of chapter 1 is about this. It's about kind of the widespread burnout that I experienced in our culture, the idea of languishing that got a lot of popularity during the pandemic and right afterwards. And so there's kind of a long introduction to this idea of weariness, and then I'll pick up in the middle of it. What I found is that the holiest people in Christianity's history, across time and cultures, have returned again and again to a common question: how do I keep going? Our older brothers and sisters, those who've gone before us, were not always full of ardor, and God often felt distant. In life and in faith, they were not always sure what to do or how to go on. They failed, they flailed, they doubted, they felt like giving up. Yet they found a way through to flourishing, to hope, to abundance, and they left a record for us of what they discovered. I'm going to skip a little part here, but that does give the book is a lot about voices from Christian history who wrote, honestly, a lot more about kind of languishing, about the middle section of faith than I think that we talk about now, particularly in the American church. So I'll keep going. Revivalism has warped religious faith in America, perhaps especially in the peculiar and diverse movement called evangelicalism. The point of revivalism is to get people to walk the aisle, to make a decision for Christ. It's why we love conversion stories and emotional responses to God. We are rightly moved when we hear about how people were once lost and now are found. These are great stories. Lately, there's also an increasing popularity of deconversion stories. These are accounts of people seeing the light and leaving the faith in one way or another. They shed, for instance, their fundamentalist past for progressive politics, or a pastiche of spiritualities, or a contented agnosticism. What our culture and what the church tends to lack are stories of a long, steady continuation in faith. We revel in newness and youthful passion. We might even occasionally laud the wisdom of years, the sages, the gurus, the living legends. But we don't have categories for the prolonged middle, for the slog, especially if the slog is accompanied by the feeling of abandonment by or distance from God. Here's the thing, though. We can't get from newfound ardor to tried and tested wisdom without the winding middle. This book is about the perseverance it takes not just to endure, but to embrace the middle. It's about what the Christian tradition often called fortitude, but we now more commonly name resilience. Perseverance and resilience are unsung virtues, not nearly as splashy as courage or justice. They can seem tired or uninteresting. They eat your vegetables of the spiritual life. But I have come to believe that perseverance is the most vital quality in a lifetime of discipleship, that grit is an essential ingredient of grace, and that resilience is indispensable if we are to become who we are made to be. What I need and what I long for are stories of reconversion, of coming back to Jesus day by day over a lifetime, of being lost and found again and again. I want to learn from those who have slowly discovered the long way to what lasts.
Your writing is really exceptional, and I do think you put your finger on something that is very profound, and it's part of the reason that I found the book so compelling to read. It's also partly that having been a pastor for over 40 years and having walked with so many people in the middle season, I'm aware that as a pastor, you get a close view of what you're writing about because you're walking with people in mostly middle Middle Earth, if you want to use that
Yes.
phrase, the Middle Earth of ordinary sized objects and people and circumstances in all of their glory and struggle and pain and challenge and beauty and wonder. And it's the close in opportunity to see and know how that unfolds that I kept finding myself thinking about again and again as I was reading the book, because I know so many saints that would be huge exemplars of the kind of persistence and resilience that you're describing, and that willingness in a way to come to faith again and again. It's a really wonderful and apt description. I wonder, as you were going through that season, and perhaps are still in part in it, since it never seems to truly fully leave us, I just wonder if when you were finished writing this book, what did it feel to you had experienced in your own journey that was part of the experience of completing such an important reflection as this book is?
Yeah, I wrote this book. I wasn't planning on writing this book. I was actually planning on writing a different book. But I wrote this book because I needed to figure out how to keep going in my own life. And I kind of feel like I did. Not that I'm not in the middle anymore. I mean, I very much am. And this is a very sort of midlife, mid-faith kind of book. But there were some things that were really key for me. First of all, to know that a sense of God's distance is not necessarily that you are doing something wrong, or that you need to gin up some level of faith, that this is seen as a really normal and important part of Christian maturation in the faith was important to me. I think rediscovering the practice of stability, not as just something that monks do, but that is for all of us, and that we need stabilitas cordis, stability of the heart. This was stability of the heart is language I actually had not been exposed to until I wrote this book. But I think it was very, very helpful for me. There is a narrative in culture that I have imbibed a lot where women get to my age, which is kind of mid-40s, and they're overwhelmed and they're tired and marriage is hard and life is hard and faith is hard. And they the idea is kind of like blow up your life and start again. Go eat, pray, love, deconstruct your faith, maybe leave your spouse, maybe even if it's not that, it's kind of like a reinvent yourself in one way or the other. And I needed some option that didn't feel like kind of just muddle through and live a consumeristic life and get your kids off to college and kind of be a suburban consumer, or and live in kind of like quiet desperation in that situation, or like blow up your life, reinvent yourself, go to, Tibet or or Paris and start anew. I needed some other option that felt meaningful and deep and rich and rooted. And so this idea of stability itself being a practice, that our practice isn't just prayer or worship, but in the continuation of those things and the continuation of community. I feel like stability is such an important practice, but it's not talked about a lot unless you happen to be a Benedictine monk. And so that was really helpful for me. And then I think the results of those things, of stability in my own life, has just been to see how much I'm a striver, how much I sort of want to seek God, live the Christian life, take up practices of prayer, whatever, remain faithful to my children and husband. And then, and some of that is out of good impulses, but there's almost a sense of, hey, God, I'm putting my effort in, and you have to show up with a particular result. That God becomes kind of like an app, like an Uber driver. And it was difficult for me to see that in my own life because that doesn't look like the typical prosperity gospel. I mean, I've been through enough and I've been theologically educated enough to know that it's not like I pray and I get a check in the mail, or that my kids are promised to be healthy or any of that, but that I basically kind of expect a sense of spiritual fulfillment or creative fulfillment or, a success, perhaps not the way the world defines success, but success in the way I define success.
Right.
And that even that is a kind of striving that God is inviting me away from into the sufficiency of God alone. And that almost sounds trite because we've heard that since we, if you're a Christian, you've heard that a long time. But it showed me how much I come to God wanting to consume God as a consumer product and not as this sort of unpredictable, uncontrollable God who loves me regardless of, whether or not whether or not I'm, doing great in the prayer life or not. So it feels that, rediscovering stability was huge for me, but also rediscovering, I think, grace in the midst of that there's a kind of a ceasing, a call to be still, a call to cease striving that I have to learn to take up in a deeper way.
Mm-hmm. In the opening chapter, you talk about this metaphor and non-metaphor, stay in your cell. I wonder if you could sort of take us into the Desert Fathers for a moment and Mothers and give us a bearing on that, because it concretizes what you're just saying, the sense of location, place in the deepest sense. Tell us what that means and why you began your book there.
Yeah. So the Desert Mothers and Fathers, this, for listeners who may not know, are 3rd through 5th century men and women who went and literally lived out in the desert. And when over and over again, you see this, I was just looking at some of their sayings this morning, and again, you hear this call to stay in your cell, to return to your cell if you have left. And for them, that was a call to continue in the life of a monk, to continue in the rhythms and habits of prayer. The cell was literally the place that a monk lived and prayed and worked. So it involves all of that. It was not just a place of prayer. It was a place of work. It was a place of life. And so it was a literal, usually a small room or a hut or a cave. But more broadly, it meant to stay in the life of a monk, to not go back to the city or the life you had before, but to stay in the rhythms of prayer and habits of a monk, to continue on the spiritual quest, and to stay with a particular community, to actually remain in the community you're in. There were all kinds of reasons that monks were tempted to leave their cell. A huge one was just distraction and boredom. It got boring and they wanted something more fun. But also there were stories of people being kind of overwhelmed by their sin and feeling like God isn't taking temptation out of my life. God isn't taking lust out of my life. I've been praying that God would remove me from temptation, and I'm still full of anger. And so they would be out of that. They would leave their cell. They would say, I'm not good enough to be a monk. And these elders would say, just return to your cell, that it is not your own effort, it is God's mercy. Or they would have nostalgia. They would think, nostalgia and fantasy were huge here. They would think, oh, if I was somewhere else, God would use me more. I could be more holy. And so there was this constant call to just remain where you are, in the place you're at, with the people you're at, with even in the midst of the incompleteness and struggle of that. It was this call back to not give up, to keep struggling. And you just see it constantly. It's hard to overstate how often this comes up in the writings. And I hadn't heard that. I hadn't heard that in that way. I had read some desert mothers and fathers, but the notion of staying in your cell, it seemed so much more holistic to me than like the evangelical, like keep at your quiet time kind of advice. It was a call to even stay in kind of the ordinary work of your life, the ordinary relationships of your life, the community you were in, even to remain with God in places you've been disappointed by God. So it's this holistic call, which then Benedict picks up and makes a vow of stability, but is really drawing from this idea of staying in your cell.
Staying is like the last thing that our culture tends to feed. You know, we're constantly fed move, change, alter, upset, reorient, as opposed to this language of staying. I remember by the time I graduated from high school, I wasn't a Christian. That wasn't the world that I was even interested in. I was interested at one stage in finding what, quote, the peaceful life meant. And I started reading, interestingly, some of the desert mothers and fathers with no clue what I was reading, really. I was just reading this literature that had come to my attention. And what struck me was that they had come into this isolation, as one might have expected naively, as I was at 18, expecting that somehow this would be a place of solace and quiet and peace. Whereas when I read the journals and the reflections on their lives, it was this extraordinary journey of turbulence and challenge, because it brought them face to face with their own personal crises and or the issues of the world, of God, of human nature, and so forth. And what I realized, though I had no bearings for understanding really what this meant, that it all turned for them on something to do with God and on something to do with a God who was present in all of that turbulence. So I understood my own turbulence. That was pretty clear to me. But what I didn't understand was this call to a person, Jesus, who actually was the turning point around which all of this other turbulence somehow found its resolution. But it wasn't about a quietism. It was about a facing of the raw realities of people's lives and the unexpectedness and the pain and the suffering and the sin and all of that. And it was ultimately then through reading the Gospels that I came to faith in Christ, because I could see that there was something that was on offer that completely eluded me and which I had not ever experienced before. And it was really this profound center. So when I was reading your book, one of the things that I was doing was going back through those memories of years now, decades ago, when, to my shock, which it is still truly shocking to me that I'm a Christian, and the shock was this discovery, in a way, of staying in your cell. It was not an invitation to abandon the life that I was living, but to actually recenter it and then give myself to it even more significantly. So at 18, 19,
that's beautiful. That would be good in the book. That's kind of the point.
Right. That was a huge pivot. It was like, so this is the reality out of which all other reality is meant to somehow find its home. And that it was clear to me that Jesus was not an escape artist, that he was not leading us toward an escapist life. And that's always been kind of in a way, the grittier part of the journey of faith. And I think part of why, in the end, when to my great surprise, again, total disorienting shock, that I became a pastor, it was like, oh, this is actually what all of that was about. Now I'm with people in their cells, and we are in a common cell called a community of faith, but we are also in our individual cells, and the two constantly interact. But the rawness, the utter unfinishedness of it was what drew me to pastoral ministry, and is probably the part about no longer serving actively in that kind of role that I miss the most. It's being in the mess with people who are wherever we all are. And certainly at a moment like this, when the American church, in my view, is facing so many self-created tragedies and nightmares of our own spiritual, theological, and or political making.
Lots of mess.
And that is just a gigantic, gigantic mess. So what does it mean to know and find and live out of Christ in that mess, which is the long middle that we're now all in together as in the United States, and certainly for churches around the world as well?
Yeah, that's right. Everything you said, I just endorse and think, I mean, that's a huge, everything you're saying, I kind of wish I could put in the book. But I think that what we're kind of sold in the culture is that if you make the right choices, work hard, marry the right people or person, I mean, do the right thing, get the right job, that you get eventually out of the struggle or out of the mess, that life becomes more frictionless. And the discovery, I mean, reading these Desert Fathers and Mothers, you don't ever get to a place of like kind of pacific calmness. Like the struggle is just always there. And that doesn't mean that there isn't peace or that there isn't joy. It's just never a peace or a joy that is devoid of struggle. It's a peace and joy that's all part and parcel and wrapped up in the struggle. And I kind of kept expecting to get past the struggle. And I think part of this book is like me realizing like, oh, it just doesn't, that doesn't happen. There's not a time. That's a lie that we get, that if we sort of do the right things, we get past the struggle. You do experience gladness and delight and joy and fullness, but it's always right there with the mess and right there with the struggle. I mean, beginning to end of the Christian life, really until Jesus comes and makes things right. There's always this incompleteness, and there's always that doesn't mean that's easy. I mean, I think there's always a sadness and a disappointment about that incompleteness. But I think we meet God. That's where we meet God. We meet God in the midst of that, not on the other side of that.
Right. And I think that's asking a lot for people who just have such dramatically different expectations, that this is a form of getting it all right, having it all right, and then living it all right. So then anything that tyrannizes that, whether it could be personal pain or whether it could be the social character of things or racial issues or gendered issues or whatever it may be, then that becomes something that needs to be kept out in order for me to maintain my peace. And a lot of the weakness of the American church right now is a tendency pervasively in so many places, it seems, to fence out the turbulence as though somehow A, we can do that, and B, that would be a Christian thing to do. Whereas based on the kind of writing that you've done, period, and in this book, you present a vision of the Christian life that is really about living into the turbulence, because it is the raw stuff in which we live, but finding in that turbulence a God who never lets go and who is present with us, and then not always is present and not always is resolving as we would wish, but nevertheless present. This is why, to me, as I was reading this book, I kept thinking of a subject that I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the years, which is whether the American church should really understand itself as a church in exile, not just the American church, but the church period. All around the world, the church does understand itself to be a church in exile, often a dramatic minority population facing enormous challenges. But inside the United States, because we have this national narrative around a promised land, which is really the language of much more of empire in the end, if it's distorted by our own politics and expectations, rather than living as strangers in a strange land, trying to figure out what faithfulness means when so much doesn't fit and when we don't have the full resolutions that we would have wished for. Do you Does that resonate with your sense of what you're writing in this book?
Yeah, I don't read a ton about like political theology or the church itself, for instance, staying in our cell, although I think that's really helpful. But I mean, in general, I feel like that is my approach to life. It's in some ways, honestly, what makes it very hard at this moment for me to be a Christian writer, an evangelical writer, because I have never felt, well, I don't want to say never. Since I was a teenager, I've never felt like the church ought to, or I never felt like the church was an entity that was at home or that demanded respect. Or I grew up in Austin, which is a very blue city, and I spent a lot of time on the drag, which is a right by UT's campus. And when I was growing up, like full of everyone, it was just, here comes everyone. There were cowboys and hippies and lots of, well, we would now say unhoused at the time, with homeless kids and pagans and I mean, all kinds of dark stuff and crazy stuff. And I just never thought that what I believed was normal or mainstream or was any kind of social boon. It just made me weird. And so I just never, I didn't experience Christianity as a majority faith, even though I grew up in Texas. But I just always, it was always weird. And so it never, and then of course, as I actually encountered more of the teaching of Scripture around things like a radical generosity to the poor and forgiveness of enemies, like this never seemed like this fit into America to me. And yet I also never just kind of went wholesale social gospel. I never really bought into, I'm actually writing a piece on this right now, but if the moral majority, and I did grow up around the church, but I was in a really blue city in the midst of that. So I guess I just had always been really skeptical of the culture wars and never really felt like I fit in. So if the moral majority was kind of dressing Jesus up and putting him in a red tie, it didn't seem like a solution to just for then to me put Jesus in a blue tie.
Right.
So I guess I've always thought that we were in exile. But even if, let's say, and I believe this really deeply, let's say we, whether one's vision of the kingdom coming is like, whatever, all dismantling capitalism and having a socialist state, or the opposite, going back to like 1950s American conservatism. First of all, neither of those options sound super awesome to me, but it also just feels like our primary exile isn't a political state. It's that we're in sin. I mean, I think even if like all the candidates that I wanted to get elected got elected, I mean, I'm a pastor. Like the people that are struggling in my church, it's not that it's not affected by politics, but that it's like the deepest struggles in their life are pain of broken relationships. It's pain of addiction in their own life. It's pain of self-righteousness. It's pain of like, children that are estranged from them, or it just feels so much more pervasive than what any policy or polity could solve. So I don't know. I think my sense of exile is pretty profound.
Right.
But I never really thought politics could solve it.
No.
So that hasn't changed for me.
Right. Well, I agree with you entirely. It's not a political solution. But even Israel, of course, experienced exile in part as primarily a political problem. But the work of exile was always about, if I take away as a spiritual discipline all the signs of your evident blessing, and say, now, what does it mean to be faithful in exile as a stranger in a strange land? You end up with entirely different questions and a different sort of formation that's not built out of the presumption of blessing, but out of the utter dependency on a God who meets us in, like, the cell that you're referring to so much through your book. I think that's part of why it speaks significantly, and hope that it finds an audience of people who are hungry for what to do in that cell that is constructive in the building of a long discipleship, and a discipleship, as you describe, that grows in a weary land and that requires resilience. Tell a story in your pastoral experience of a person who you may have known well. I'd like it to be somebody in your congregation who you would, not necessarily publicly, but that you would internally think of as an exemplar of a person on this long road of resilience that you're describing.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think I have several. I'll just tell you the first person who came to mind was, I don't know. I honestly haven't thought. So I haven't thought this is the exemplar of that. So I'm just going to name one person because it was literally the first person that popped to mind. It was my friend Charlie. Charlie is at the former church I served in Pittsburgh. He is in his mid-70s, and he is just profoundly joyful in a way that I currently do not experience. And some of this one could say is like, oh, this is just Charlie. This is his personality, which maybe is true, except that he tells a story of he grew up in a rough place, in a hard house to grow up in a hard neighborhood to grow up in. And he would say, and I hope it's okay, Charlie, I hope it's okay I'm sharing this, but I will not get into the details, but he would say that he was an angry person for a really long time. But Charlie kept going to church, he kept seeking God. He kept walking in community. He served the poor. He actually was arrested for protesting nuclear weapons. And he would say that midway through his life, I think he was even older, like 50 or 60, God did some really profoundly healing work in him that allowed him to forgive family members who had really harmed him in a profound way. And that he experiences the love of God, like the kindness of God, in a more profound way than he ever has. And so he's someone I look at and I'm like, he just, and he lost a wife to cancer. He has suffered, and he went through a long middle, like we all do, where, he was just working and doing life, and it's not, and he is not perfect, but he just has the joy of the Lord, and he believes this stuff. I mean, he's bet his life on the gospel, and he has, he's getting older now. He's lost friends, close friends of his have died, and he is truly and genuinely looking forward to heaven. And yeah, so, and he prays for me and for my children just all the time. I mean, he constantly is texting us that he's praying for us. He has a bit of he's not a monk. He's remarried, but he has, in the same way of these desert fathers and mothers, he has these rhythms and habits of prayer kind of woven into his life that he's just kept at for years and years and years and years. So it's not like every moment of his Christian life has been abundant and spiritual, but it's like the cumulative effect of a lifetime has made him a person of kind of incandescent joy. And it's funny, my kids, they're teenagers, and they just there's just hardly anyone in this world that they would rather be around. And he doesn't live in our town anymore, but they love him and look up to him. And it's interesting, and teenagers don't often love to just hang out with 70-year-olds, but when someone loves you, and when someone has lived their life in a way that is honest and joyful and rooted, and he's so rooted, man. I mean, he lives within 20 miles of where it was the house he was born in. But there's this abundance and fruitfulness that people are drawn to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's a wonderful story. Wonderful story. I do think that there is a patience that's required toward ourselves, toward God, and toward others around us that's part of this resilience. And I just wondered if you could reflect a bit on that. There's part of the difficulty of living in this space and being resilient is that we are understandably impatient. And I'm not meaning that just in the cheap sense of wanting something instantaneously. I'm meaning even over long chapters. I mean, I think, for example, a person that I would put in my life in parallel with Charlie is a woman that I knew for many, many years who's now passed away, but her name was Hilda. And Hilda was a long road person, and she never married, and she led a very deeply devotional life. But what she mostly did was lead a life of encouragement. That was her primary spiritual gift. And whether it was in her professional workplace or whether it was in relationships, it was this incredible sense of joy and patience for God. And the heart of that, for me, as she would tell her story, was praying every day since the time she herself had become a Christian for the conversion of her father. And she prayed for him every day for 58 years through all of the ups and downs and ins and outs of his life and everything else. And sure enough, 58 years later, her father, not in any direct way connected to her, had this amazing conversion where suddenly God was just present to him in a way that
That's amazing.
He couldn't undo. And when Hilda told me this news and we had tears together over what all that meant, to me, it was in part this story of Hilda's willingness to be patient that was built into her resilience in that kind of a way. That's, again, one of the challenges of the book that I think is so rich, is that it is a call to a deeper, clearer, longer, harder road that is both personal and communal. But I wonder, to turn to the communal part for a moment, as a priest in the Anglican Church, I'm just wondering, how does this book relate to a community?
Yeah. Well, one of the things so I wrote this book to kind of discover how to keep going, like how to build resilience. I do think I want to say a little bit more about patience, and I will answer this. I'll try to pull it back around to answer your question. But I think patience, I just do not think we talk about patience enough in the church. In the American church especially. I think because patience has been used to justify injustice in the past. I mean, very famously, letter to Birmingham jail is kind of a call against patience, which it can be abused that way. But I think the combination of the fact that it's been misused, we live in a consumeristic society, and patience doesn't fit well with that. If patience doesn't, impatience is what keeps you buying things, trying to fix things, trying to make things faster. Patience doesn't make anybody any money. And so it can be discouraged in that sense. And then I think that the actual rhythm of our life, our speed builds in us impatience. And when I look back at these desert fathers and mothers, they talk about patience all the time. The idea that you would pray for something or struggle with a particular sin for decades and decades and decades and just keep going, keep praying, keep struggling is normative. It's just expected. And I don't know that we give people that long of a view. I don't know if in discipleship we prepare young people to just to be that patient. And I think that works its way out in our political theology in all kinds of ways that I won't even get into to come back to your point about community. But one of the things that I did learn in the process of trying to figure out how to keep going, and that I don't think I even realized till after the book was done and I was editing it and reflecting it, is how much I end up talking about community in the book. And I really don't think we can be resilient as individuals very well. I think it requires community. I think the way that we foster resilience or perseverance is collectively, is together with one another in community and with the community of the historic church. I mean, I feel like I'm in community with Christians who had to wait their whole lives for things. I'm in community with these desert fathers and mothers. And so I think all of this points to hope. I think the thing that enables patience is hope. That it's not here and now is not all we have, that the next political cycle is not what Christians are focused on. We're focused on a much longer work of God, but of course we're focused on an eternal work of God and God setting things right. But also even like I need to plant things and build things and work for things that I'm not going to see the fruition of, that I'm hoping will make the church a better place for my grandchildren or great-grandchildren, that I'm hoping will make American politics better for our children or grandchildren. But those are like, that is like such a long view. It's like, so it's small repair. It's seeking healthy churches. It's really slow institutional change. It's disappointing in the present, and it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I worry that when we have a society where we want to sort of have the hot take, like we're just never cultivating the long view that is really, really necessary. And so I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not talking enough about community. I'll say this in the book. I talk about hope and how we have to carry hope together. That we actually aren't able to kind of get to a place of hope alone. We do this, of course, through our liturgy and through gathered worship. But I quote Kurt Thompson, the psychiatrist in the book, who said the human brain is capable of doing really hard things for a long period of time, but it is not capable of doing it alone. In other words, it is only capable of that when it does not have to do those hard things by itself. That we need other brains. We need other humans that we deeply emotionally connect to help us carry hope. And I think that's true.
Well, I think this book is an example of you're finding some of those people who have been walking with us for now nearly millennia, more than millennia, who have provoked the long road and in their own story, very specific, located in their literal cell. And that journey continues even today, even in the richness of these reflections. I really hope, Tish, that this book gets a great reading because it deserves it, and because it's getting at times almost the molecular qualities of what it takes to be in the long journey of faith, but also it holds this much larger narrative that you've just sketched of hope that is really about a God who is carefully and excessively patiently working out his will in a world that is anything but immediately responsive. So I have been the recipient of a great gift in this, and I thank you for giving it to us. I thank you for the challenge that it is, and also for the refreshment. I remember again, just soon after I became a Christian in college. And I was in various college Bible studies, and people would be talking about struggling, quote, with their prayer life, unquote. And I understood, at least in that very early time, what that meant, but what it looked like was people struggling with the actual function of remaining in the cell deliberately and consciously. And I thought, I do not want to be the age that I am now, 73, and still be struggling with whether or not I'm going to have a prayer life. I mean, somewhere early, it's set in my heart that this is a work that has to begin now, and it has to be just daily lived out over the long haul. Never completely, never fully, never adequately, but it has been that work. And I feel like, in addition to the challenges of this book, it was also an encouragement, because it felt very much like, yeah, this is that road. I know this road that's being described. And it is as difficult, as circuitous, as disappointing, confusing at times as it can be. And it is nevertheless a road of hope. So thank you for both of those dimensions, as well as much more.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your wisdom and leadership over the years.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.